Netanyahu isn't losing sleep over Iran anymore. He's losing sleep over Turkey. While the cameras were still pointed at the wreckage of Iran's nuclear program, Israel's prime minister was doing something almost nobody expected. He picked up the phone to Trump before a NATO summit even started. He went on Fox, then CNN, days apart, and he spent almost none of that airtime on Iran. He spent it on a single fighter jet, the F-35 and whether the United States should sell it to Turkey. That is not how a government behaves when it thinks it just won. That is how a government behaves when it senses the ground shifting under something it assumed was permanent. So what does Israel actually think it's about to lose? And why is the answer pointing not east toward Tehran, but north toward Ankara? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest breaking news and geopolitical updates. There is a detail buried under the last week of headlines that almost nobody has stopped to sit with. In the middle of an actual shooting war, with Iran's air force gutted and its nuclear infrastructure in ruins, the Israeli government's most urgent, most publicly waged diplomatic campaign wasn't aimed at Tehran at all. It was aimed at Ankara. Benjamin Netanyahu called Donald Trump before the NATO summit had even begun. Within days of each other, he appeared on Fox and then on CNN, and in both interviews he spent the bulk of his airtime not on Iran's missile stockpile or its remaining nuclear capacity, but on a single, oddly specific question: whether Washington should sell F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. Think about how strange that is on its face. A government that just led a war against what it has called an existential threat to its east should, in theory, be talking about that threat. Instead, it spent the week obsessing over an arms deal with a country it isn't at war with. Unless, of course, the actual threat Israel is most worried about right now isn't the one lying in ruins to its east. It's the one still standing, fully intact, to its north. To understand why this matters, you need the mechanics of the dispute itself, because the specifics carry real weight here. Turkey was expelled from the F-35 program back in 2019, after it went ahead and purchased Russia's S-400 air defense system over direct objections from Washington. The reasoning at the time wasn't political theater. It was technical and serious. You cannot operate a stealth aircraft engineered to be invisible to a specific category of radar in the same airspace as the very system built to detect exactly that kind of radar signature, without risking the aircraft's most sensitive secrets leaking straight into Moscow's hands. So Turkey got locked out. And rather than simply accept that ceiling, Ankara did what a country with genuine industrial ambition does. It started building its own alternative. The result is the KAAN, a fifth-generation stealth fighter designed to give Turkey a capability it no longer has to ask anyone else's permission to use. There's just one problem. The KAAN needs engines, and the engines Turkey actually wants happen to be American, produced by the same manufacturer that builds the F-35's power plant, which means this isn't really one dispute stitched together to look complicated. It's genuinely two separate questions tangled into a single diplomatic fight: whether Turkey gets back into the F-35 program outright, and whether it gets the engines it needs to finish an independent stealth fighter program with or without Washington's blessing. Trump, for his part, has been signaling for weeks that he's inclined to move towards some version of yes. He told reporters last month that he was about to do something that would make Erdogan very happy. By the time he actually landed in Ankara for the summit, he was standing beside the Turkish president, telling the assembled cameras that Turkey had been, in his own words, a more loyal partner than some others. That is a pointed sentence to say out loud, with Israel's prime minister watching from Jerusalem. And Netanyahu did not take it quietly. In his CNN appearance, he described Turkey's government as shaped by Muslim Brotherhood influence, hostile to American interests despite its NATO membership, and explicitly said Erdogan is not what he would call a model ally. Ankara fired back almost immediately, calling the entire campaign a coordinated disinformation effort, and accusing Netanyahu of trying to distract international attention from his own government's conduct in Gaza. By the closing press conference of the summit, Erdogan dismissed the Israeli objection in a single sentence, saying it simply had no place in how he saw the world. You could read all of that as fairly standard diplomatic sniping. Two governments that dislike each other trading barbs over an arms sale, the kind of thing that happens constantly in international politics and usually changes very little. I don't think that's actually what's happening here, and it's worth walking through why. Start with the timing. This flare-up isn't occurring in isolation. It's occurring in the exact window where Iran, historically the dominant military and ideological power radiating outward from Tehran across the wider region, has just been catastrophically weakened. Its supreme leader is dead. Its air force has been gutted. Its naval capacity in the Gulf has been badly degraded. Its economy has been strangled by months of blockade and open war. Power vacuums in that part of the world do not stay empty for long. Something always moves to fill the space a declining power leaves behind. And right now, there are exactly two credible candidates positioned to do it. Israel, riding the momentum of having just led the campaign that broke Iran's military capacity, and Turkey, which sat this particular war out entirely and comes out the other side with its military, its economy, and its regional standing fully intact. Netanyahu has more or less admitted this framing himself, in remarks about how history rewards whichever regional power rises fastest once another one begins to fall. Take that seriously, because it's coming directly from the man-setting Israeli strategy, and the F-35 dispute stops looking like a squabble over hardware. It starts looking like exactly what it probably is, a proxy fight over which of these two states inherits the position Iran is being forced to vacate. The hardware itself isn't incidental to that fight, because air superiority has quietly underwritten almost everything Israel has done militarily for the last 2 decades. Every strike deep into Iranian, Syrian, or Lebanese territory. Every operation carried out with minimal fear of a serious aerial contest. All of it has depended on Israel effectively owning the skies over a region where no immediate neighbor could seriously challenge that dominance. Turkey holding F-35s doesn't erase that advantage overnight. But it does something almost as consequential. It introduces genuine uncertainty into a calculation that used to be, for Israeli planners, a foregone conclusion. Turkey already fields the second largest standing army in NATO, behind only the United States itself. It maintains its own defense industrial base, capable of producing missiles and drones domestically, and is now attempting a 5th-generation fighter built largely from scratch. Add stealth aircraft with the same operational pedigree as Israel's own fleet, and you've converted a regional balance that used to tilt heavily and predictably toward Jerusalem into something considerably less certain. That is close to the exact language Netanyahu used publicly, warning that this sale would upset a balance of power he described as ultimately guaranteed by Israeli air superiority. He isn't being subtle about what he thinks is actually at stake. It helps to understand how this relationship got to a point this adversarial, because it wasn't always this way. For much of the late 20th century, Turkey and Israel arguably maintained the strongest bilateral relationship either country had with any other state in the region. Joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, a genuine strategic partnership built on Turkey's secular Western-facing orientation. The model Ataturk had established decades earlier. That relationship began eroding once Erdogan consolidated power and steadily reoriented Turkish identity and foreign policy away from that secular template, towards something rooted more explicitly in the country's Ottoman and Islamic inheritance. The decline wasn't instant. It moved through a long sequence of incidents and diverging interests across years. But the October 2023 attack on Israel, and the 2 years of war in Gaza that followed, accelerated that deterioration sharply. Erdogan has since described Israel in some of the harshest terms available to a sitting head of state, short of formally declaring hostility, drawing comparisons to historical atrocities, invoking religious language against the Israeli state during public remarks, and positioning himself as one of the most vocal defenders of Hamas anywhere in the world. Turkey's foreign minister has added to that recently, using language severe enough that Israel's own foreign ministry accused him outright of incitement. This is not frosty diplomacy between distant acquaintances. This is two NATO-adjacent regional powers speaking about each other roughly the way openly hostile states speak about one another during wartime, without technically being at war. Syria is worth pausing on, because it's become the clearest physical arena where these two governments are already colliding rather than simply trading rhetoric from a distance. With the old regime in Damascus gone, both Ankara and Jerusalem have moved to shape whatever comes next, and their visions for that outcome don't remotely align. Turkey has poured political and military weight behind the new governing structure taking shape there, treating a friendly Damascus as a natural extension of its own regional reach. Israel, meanwhile, has continued striking targets inside Syrian territory whenever it judges its own security requires it, entirely independent of whatever arrangement Turkey is trying to build on the ground. Two regional powers with fundamentally different visions for the same neighboring country, both possessing real military capability with very little coordination between them. That is exactly the kind of setup that produces friction nobody planned for and nobody fully controls once it actually starts. There's a deeper asymmetry in this rivalry that gets missed when coverage stays fixated on Netanyahu's television appearances. Israel's core strategic advantage in the region has never really been raw size. It's precision, air power, deep intelligence penetration, and a willingness to use all three decisively and often preemptively. Turkey's advantage runs almost the opposite direction: mass. Millions of men theoretically available for mobilization. A manufacturing base capable of producing weapons at a scale Israel's economy was never built to match. And geography that puts Turkey astride Europe, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. These are two fundamentally different kinds of power, and historically they've rarely needed to be measured directly against each other because their interests didn't overlap enough to force the comparison. What's changed is that Iran's decline has opened exactly the kind of vacuum where both approaches now compete for the same prize, forcing a comparison neither side was fully prepared to make. Israel's model tends to win any single engagement. Turkey's model wins on endurance and sheer capacity to absorb losses while continuing to produce more. Which one actually matters more depends entirely on what kind of contest this eventually turns into. And right now, nobody, including the two governments directly involved, seems entirely sure which kind of contest that will be. It's also worth being honest about the selectivity in how Netanyahu has chosen to frame all of this. He's built his objection to the F-35 sale partly around Erdogan's record on internal repression, jailing journalists, silencing political opponents, the steady erosion of anything resembling an independent judiciary. Those criticisms aren't manufactured. They're broadly accurate descriptions of how Erdogan has governed for years, but that same standard hasn't been applied consistently elsewhere. Netanyahu spent years defending an expanded relationship with Saudi Arabia, a government with its own well-documented record on political dissent and press freedom, because that relationship served a larger strategic goal around normalization. He's maintained a notably warmer public posture toward Moscow than toward Ankara, despite Russia's own extensive record of silencing and even eliminating political opponents, because Israel has needed a working relationship with Russia to operate freely over Syrian airspace. None of this makes the criticism of Erdogan factually wrong. It just tells you the criticism isn't really the argument. It's the packaging around an argument about power and proximity, deployed selectively depending on which government's rise actually threatens Israel's position and which one doesn't. Trump's role in all of this deserves its own scrutiny because he's clearly enjoying being courted by both sides without fully committing to either. He's praised Erdogan personally and repeatedly, calling him an extraordinary leader, even as Netanyahu was on American television describing Erdogan's government in far darker terms just days earlier. At the same time, Trump has publicly credited himself with keeping Turkey out of direct participation in the Iran war, using that as evidence that Erdogan isn't the hostile actor Netanyahu portrays him as. That's a useful position for Trump to occupy, because it lets him extract leverage from both relationships simultaneously. Arms sales and access dangled in front of Ankara, reassurance and continued military cooperation extended to Jerusalem, with neither government able to confidently predict which way he'll ultimately move on any given question. Whether that's a deliberate strategy of managed ambiguity or simply the natural result of a president who genuinely enjoys being liked by strong leaders on both sides of a regional rivalry, the practical effect is the same either way. Washington's actual position keeps shifting, depending on who spoke to him most recently, and both governments know it, which is exactly why they keep lobbying so aggressively rather than assuming the relationship is already settled. Israel isn't even the only government raising the alarm, and that detail is worth sitting with. Greece has objected to the same F-35 sale for reasons that have nothing to do with Iran or the wider Middle East at all, and everything to do with a much older, much more local dispute over the Eastern Mediterranean and the continued division of Cyprus. Erdogan dismissed both objections in the same breath at that closing press conference, treating Athens and Jerusalem as though they were raising an identical complaint for an identical reason. They weren't, not really. But the fact that two separate governments with almost nothing else in common strategically arrived at the same conclusion about the danger of arming Turkey with this particular aircraft tells you something. This isn't a uniquely Israeli anxiety dressed up as regional concern. It's a pattern that several of Turkey's neighbors have independently converged on, watching the same trajectory and reaching the same uneasy assessment about where an increasingly assertive, increasingly well-armed Ankara is actually headed. There's a piece of recent Israeli domestic politics tangled into this too, and it doesn't look coincidental. A few weeks before this latest flare-up, Israel's cabinet formally voted to recognize the Ottoman-era mass killing of Armenians as genocide, a step Jerusalem had pointedly avoided for decades, specifically to protect its relationship with Ankara. Reviving that recognition now, at the exact moment the F-35 fight is heating up, isn't really aimed at correcting a historical record that's been available and largely undisputed among historians for 100 years. It's aimed at Washington and at the wider audience of American lawmakers who will ultimately have some say over whether this sale proceeds. Raising a century-old atrocity at a strategically convenient moment is what diplomats sometimes call weaponizing history. Not because the history isn't real, but because the timing of when a government suddenly decides to acknowledge it publicly tells you far more about present calculations than about any newfound commitment to historical accuracy. Israel had the opportunity to make that recognition at any point over the last several decades. It made it now, days before Trump sat down with Erdogan in Ankara. That points to something important about how this rivalry is actually being fought, because very little of it is happening through direct confrontation. It's happening through exactly this kind of maneuvering. A genocide recognition, timed for maximum diplomatic pressure. Television interviews stacked one after another in the days before a summit. A foreign ministry statement calling the other side's objections a coordinated disinformation campaign. Both governments understand perfectly well that neither can afford an actual military confrontation with the other right now, not with Israel still absorbing the cost of the Iran war, and Turkey deeply invested in projects that depend on regional stability rather than regional conflict. So the contest plays out instead in the spaces where each government still has real leverage. Influence over American arms sales, control of the historical narrative, and positioning in third-party conflicts where they can support opposing sides without directly engaging each other. It's worth pulling apart the specific language Netanyahu keeps reaching for, because the words aren't accidental. Calling Erdogan's government infected by Muslim Brotherhood influence does two things at once. It links Turkey rhetorically to a movement that Washington and several of Turkey's own neighbors already treat with deep suspicion. And it implicitly separates today's Turkey from the more secular, more conventionally pro-American image the country cultivated for most of the 20th century, reminding an American audience that whatever Turkey used to be, it isn't that anymore. When Netanyahu adds that Turkey openly wants to restore the Ottoman Empire, he's reaching for something even more specific. The suggestion that Erdogan's ambitions aren't just about regional influence within existing borders, but about actual territorial and civilizational restoration, an empire that once stretched from the Balkans through the Levant and deep into the Arabian Peninsula. That's a loaded historical reference to make about a sitting NATO ally, and it's designed to land the same way with an American audience that it lands with Israeli voters, as evidence that Turkey's ambitions are fundamentally incompatible with the current regional order the United States has spent decades underwriting. Whether that characterization is fair or wildly overstated is a genuinely contested question. Turkish officials reject it outright, and nothing in Erdogan's actual policy record points toward literal territorial conquest of the kind the phrase implies. But contested or not, the framing does real work, because it reframes a fight over one arms sale into a fight over civilizational trajectory, which is a much harder argument for Washington to simply wave away with an engineering assessment about radar signatures and stealth coatings. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how much this entire episode reflects Israel operating from a position of anxiety rather than confidence, despite having just emerged from a war that, on paper, eliminated its most dangerous regional rival. That's the detail that should give you pause if you're inclined to read this as simple opportunism on Netanyahu's part. A government riding high after a decisive military campaign doesn't usually spend the following week lobbying frantically against a single arms sale to a country it isn't even at war with. It does that when it senses the ground shifting under a strategic position it had assumed was more durable than it's now turning out to be. Winning the war against Iran hasn't delivered the uncontested regional primacy Israel might have expected. It's delivered a vacuum, and vacuums, as noted earlier, don't stay empty for long. Turkey moved into that space almost immediately, not through military confrontation, but through exactly the kind of patient positioning. Staying out of the war, courting Washington, expanding its industrial base, that looks unremarkable in any single month, and only becomes obviously consequential once you step back and look at the trajectory across years. Which brings us to something that complicates this picture in a way worth acknowledging honestly, because Turkey hasn't been purely adversarial toward Israel, even during this period of open hostility. Ankara played an active mediating role in the talks that eventually secured the release of the last Israeli hostages held by Hamas, with American officials confirming that Trump personally called Erdogan for help bringing reluctant Hamas figures to the table during those negotiations. That's a strange thing for a government that regularly compares Israel's leadership to history's worst regimes to also be quietly useful to Israeli interests on one of the issues that mattered most to Jerusalem this past year. But it isn't actually a contradiction once you understand what Erdogan is optimizing for. He wants to be indispensable to Washington, to the wider Sunni world, to anyone negotiating a settlement in this region, because indispensability is its own form of power, arguably a more durable one than open military confrontation. Being the leader who can actually deliver results gives Turkey a seat at tables it wouldn't otherwise be invited to, even while its rhetoric toward Israel stays as harsh as anything coming out of Tehran. Erdogan doesn't need consistency between his public statements and his private utility. He needs leverage, and he's been remarkably effective at accumulating it from both directions at once. That duality is arguably the most important thing to understand about where this relationship is heading, more important than any single arms deal. Turkey isn't positioning itself as Israel's enemy in the straightforward way Iran has been for decades, built around ideological rejection of Israel's existence as a state. Erdogan's hostility is real, but it coexists with a genuine willingness to work with Israeli interests when doing so serves Turkey's broader ambition to be the indispensable power brokering every major regional outcome. That makes Turkey a far more complicated adversary to plan against than Iran ever was, because you can build a coherent long-term strategy against a government whose hostility is fixed and ideological. It's much harder to build one against a government whose hostility is tactical, situational, and entirely subordinate to a larger project of accumulating regional influence by whatever means happen to be available in a given month. Israel's security establishment has spent decades calibrating its deterrence posture around adversaries who wanted it destroyed as a matter of doctrine. Turkey wants something else entirely. It wants to be the power everyone in the region eventually has to go through, Israel included. And that's a goal that can accommodate quite a lot of harsh rhetoric alongside quite a lot of quiet transactional cooperation, depending on what the moment calls for. That's also why it seems unlikely this cools down regardless of how the F-35 decision ultimately lands. If Trump approves the sale, Israel loses a piece of the exclusive military advantage it has built its regional posture around for 2 decades, and it will have every incentive to look for other ways to reassert that edge. Deeper investment in its own next-generation programs, tighter partnerships elsewhere in the region, or simply accepting a more contested, less certain airspace than it's used to operating in. If Trump blocks it, Turkey doesn't quietly accept a permanent ceiling on its ambitions. It keeps developing the KAAN independently, keeps expanding its defense industrial base, and keeps positioning itself as the indispensable regional mediator, regardless of what hardware Washington is willing to hand over. Either outcome leaves the underlying contest exactly where it started, because the F-35 was never really the prize. It was always just the most visible marker of a much larger competition over who inherits the influence a badly weakened Iran can no longer hold on to. And that competition doesn't resolve with a single arms sale decided in Washington. It resolves, if it resolves at all, over years, across multiple flashpoints, with both governments testing each other's limits in whatever arena happens to be available at the time. There's a larger point sitting underneath all of this about how American power actually functions in this region now, as opposed to how it used to function. For decades, the United States managed regional rivalries partly by carefully calibrating who got access to its most advanced weapon systems and who didn't, using that access as a lever to keep client states dependent and, to some extent, cooperative with each other. Selling the same top-tier platform to 2 states that increasingly view each other as the primary long-term threat isn't calibration anymore. It's an admission that Washington either can't or won't continue playing that managing role the way it once did. Once both Ankara and Jerusalem are flying the same aircraft, American leverage over the relationship between them shrinks considerably. Because the thing that used to make American backing so valuable, exclusive access to a capability nobody else in the region had, stops being exclusive. And there's a further complication sitting just behind all of this. Russia has reportedly been finishing production on a batch of advanced fighters ordered by Iran years ago. A reminder that if Washington won't supply an edge to whichever government asks for one, Moscow is perfectly willing to fill that gap for whoever gets left out. That dynamic pushes every regional actor toward arming up rather than standing down, because nobody wants to be the one relying on an American veto that might not hold, or an American promise that might arrive too late to matter. Which is really the point worth carrying away from all of this. This dispute over a single aircraft sale isn't really about the aircraft. It's a live demonstration of what a genuinely multipolar Middle East looks like once the old hierarchy, Washington at the top, deciding who gets what and when, starts to erode. Israel built its regional strategy for the past several decades on the assumption that American backing would always translate into a durable, largely unchallenged military edge over every plausible rival. Turkey built its own strategy on the assumption that patience, size, and staying out of other people's wars would eventually earn it the kind of standing that direct confrontation never could. Iran's collapse under the weight of this year's war has forced both of those assumptions to be tested at the same time, in the same room, in front of the same American president, who seems to enjoy the leverage that comes from keeping everyone guessing rather than resolving anything. However the F-35 question actually gets decided, the deeper contest it's standing in for doesn't end with that decision. It just moves to the next flashpoint, Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean, wherever the next test of relative strength happens to land. Watch what happens over the next 24 to 72 hours. Watch whether Washington signals movement on the engine question specifically, since that's the piece of this dispute that could shift the timeline of Turkey's independent program, regardless of what happens with the F-35 itself. Watch whether Israel escalates its own rhetoric further or quietly starts looking for off-ramps once it senses the sale is likely to happen with or without its objections. And watch Syria closely, because if this rivalry produces a genuine flashpoint anywhere in the near term, that's almost certainly where it surfaces first. What do you think Washington actually does here? And which of these two governments do you think ends up better positioned a year from now? Drop your read on it in the comments. This is a story that's still being written in real time, and the next move likely won't come from Tehran at all.